In the realm of modern agriculture, the advent of high-tech machinery has profoundly reshaped the landscape of this industry. From the production of hay and soil preparation for seeding to providing nutrients to crops and harvesting corn and wheat, these machines have increasingly become pivotal in enhancing productivity and efficiency in agricultural operations. Today, I invite you, beloved viewers of the Future Farming Tech Channel, on a journey to explore these heroic machines powering our agricultural world. Alright, let's get started. The groundbreaking debut of the Krona Big Pack in 1993 marked a seismic shift, heralding an era that alleviated the burdens carried by contractors and farmers, transforming toil into triumph. Over time, the Big Pack machines have evolved, embracing a suite of cutting-edge innovations that set the pinnacle for large square baler performance and bale excellence. These technological marvels aren't just advancements. They're a testament to Krona's commitment to transcend the challenges posed by ever-changing climatic conditions across the globe. In the face of extreme environments, from scorching heat to bone-chilling cold, relentless humidity to bone-dry conditions, or in dusty and soiled terrains, Krona's ingenuity shines, offering awe-inspiring solutions that captivate and astound. Behind the wheel of a Big Pack, farmers unlock a realm of top-tier quality, crafting bales that aren't just tightly packed but represent a testament to superior forage, robust livestock, and the promise of creamy, wholesome milk. Yet, it's not just the quality. These denser bales translate to savings, slashing transport and storage costs, especially beneficial in areas with vast distances to cover. The latest Big Pack models boast a 20% longer bale channel and top baling flaps, a paradise for perfect bale contours and density, particularly beneficial for dry crops and high-volume production. Their swiftness on the field isn't just a time saver. It's a cost-efficient feat. The high-speed models redefine fast field work, ensuring consistent high-quality bales, regardless of on-site conditions, a quintessential Krona hallmark. From inception, Krona has been attuned to customers' needs, with a keen focus on fundamental requirements like time and cost savings, especially in transportation and storage. The Big Pack High Density Press HDP stands as a monumental milestone in delivering rock-hard bales, meeting the industry's demands head-on. Accessing functionalities directly from the tractor cabin, thanks to hydraulically opening and folding side hoods, is just the tip of the iceberg in Krona's array of advancements. Field transitions can now be seamless, reducing downtime to almost zero. With Krona Power Clean, maintenance was a thing of the past, ensuring a flawless performance. Globally, farmers across diverse landscapes trust the Big Pack's reliability and superior work quality. Krona's commitment isn't just about premium product quality. It's a promise of unwavering support, with parts availability and exceptional service, ensuring confidence in every harvest, in every field, in every condition. In awe-inspiring grandeur, the Krona Big Pack stands not just as a machine but as a marvel of agricultural innovation. Its legacy, born in 1993, continues to resonate across fields, transcending challenges and delivering triumphs to the hands of hard-working farmers and contractors. The saga of the Big Pack isn't just about machines. It's a testament to Krona's unwavering commitment to excellence. Its evolution into a paragon of cutting-edge technology, delivering impeccable bales and defying the odds presented by varied climates and terrains, is nothing short of breathtaking. As the sun sets on each day's toil, the Big Pack remains a beacon of reliability, a symbol of quality etched in the annals of agriculture. With every meticulously crafted bale, it redefines efficiency, savings, and a promise of quality that resonates in the vitality of livestock and the sustenance of farms. Default. In the tapestry of farming, where challenges are abundant, the Big Pack stands tall as a companion, unfaltering in its duty, reducing downtime, and elevating the aspiration of those who rely on its prowess. Krona's unwavering commitment to support, enhance, and innovate ensures that the legacy of the Big Pack will endure, inspiring generations to come, marking a chapter in the annals of agriculture that's truly unparalleled. The John Deere 6145R Seeder and Plower stands as an inspiring testament to agricultural prowess and monumental utility. It commands the fields with unmatched power and versatility, not merely a machine but a colossal force in agriculture's arsenal. Its robust strength, epitomized by a formidable engine, orchestrates seamless operations across diverse terrains, leaving an indelible mark with its swift and masterful execution of seeding and plowing tasks. Beyond its sheer power, the John Deere 6145R embodies an artful blend of design sophistication and user-centric comfort. Within its spacious cabin, equipped with state-of-the-art amenities, it offers an oasis of ease for operators amid their toil. Yet, it's not just the machine's physical prowess but its ingenious intelligence that truly astounds. The incorporation of cutting-edge automation seamlessly optimizes work efficiency, empowering operators with intuitive and adaptive controls. The John Deere 6145R isn't just a piece of equipment. It's a marvel, a titan in the agricultural realm, bridging the gap between sheer might and technological finesse. Its amalgamation of robust power, sleek design, and futuristic technology redefines the landscape, amplifying productivity and efficiency in the agricultural domain. Displayed on the screen is the cutting-edge, top-of-the-line machinery set to launch in the near future, introducing the Oxbow 85104, a heavy-duty agricultural machine specially designed for precision farming. Achieving a remarkable 20% reduction in fuel consumption per hectare. This remarkable machine prides itself on its user-friendly interface designed for operators, providing intuitive controls that enhance operational ease. Moreover, its intelligent all-wheel steering system sets a new standard in maneuverability, ensuring seamless navigation across various terrains. GPS precision control ensures precise and accurate application. The 8510 also features crab steering, employing one wheel per track to minimize crop damage and soil compaction, making it suitable for tram lines. Furthermore, The Oxbow Liquid Nutrient Management System (LNMS) incorporated in the AT5104 includes a 22 cubic meters polyester tank, the superload system equipped with a high-capacity pump, and the option of a Borger 9 cubic meters pump, 12 cubic meters available. Oxbow provides a comprehensive range of nutrient applicators to suit various farming needs. The Oxbow at 510 epitomizes agricultural advancement, offering substantial fuel savings and intelligent functionality. With innovative features like LNMS and crab steering, it stands as a beacon of Oxbow's commitment to cutting-edge farming technology, heralding a promising, efficient future for agriculture. Upon laying eyes on the McDon FC301-C corn harvester, astonishment swept over me like a tempest. It stood there, a magnificent marvel of agricultural engineering, eliciting an overwhelming sense of awe and wonder. Its sheer size and immaculate construction caught me off guard, leaving me breathless with surprise. The unexpected sight of this colossal machine, with its grandiose frame and intricate details, evoked a sense of profound admiration. Its powerful presence in the field, poised to harvest the bounty of corn, was an astonishing spectacle that I had never anticipated. The precision and sophistication of its design, coupled with its seamless operation, left me in a state of profound amazement. Witnessing the McDon FC301-C in action was an experience that surpassed all expectations, leaving an indelible impression of wonder and admiration for the ingenuity of modern agricultural technology. The McDon FC301-C, a marvel in the realm of agricultural machinery, stands tall as the epitome of excellence in corn harvesting. A majestic colossus amidst the verdant fields, it embodies the relentless spirit of harvest, an indomitable force carving through the maize fields with unparalleled grace and power. With a colossal maw, capable of devouring rows of corn stalks in its wake, this behemoth boasts a wide cutting width, reminiscent of a titan stride across the landscape. Its blades, akin to the swords of ancient warriors, slice through the maize with precision, reaping the golden bounty of the field. Forged from the finest alloys, and crafted with the artistry of modern engineering, the McDon FC301-C stands as a testament to durability and resilience. Unyielding against the harsh demands of the harvest season, it persists with unwavering strength and unwavering determination. In the hands of skilled operators, it becomes an extension of mastery, a symphony of control and finesse. Its technological prowess, a marvel of innovation, enhances efficiency and performance, orchestrating a ballet of productivity in the heart of the cornfield. The McDon FC301-C isn't merely a machine. It's a legendary hero in the saga of corn harvesting. It symbolizes the triumph of ingenuity over adversity, a cornerstone of prosperity gleaned from the earth's abundance. A monument to agricultural advancement, it etches its heroic tale in the chronicles of farming history. In essence, McDon's FC301-C redefines the art of corn harvesting, amalgamating cutting-edge technology with ergonomic design to extract the most from every harvest. Discover the difference in performance and reliability. Find your local dealer at McDon.com and elevate your harvest to new heights. In the heartland of the United States, the sprawling wheat fields create a mesmerizing spectacle. A sea of golden wheat undulates gracefully as far as the eye can fathom. Yet, amidst this breathtaking expanse lies a bustling scene of industriousness. 10 colossal machines, marvels of modern ingenuity, tirelessly undertake the monumental task of reaping this golden treasure. These machines, meticulously crafted for the colossal endeavor of wheat harvesting, embody a fusion of cutting-edge technology and sheer power. Powered by formidable engines and equipped with state-of-the-art advancements, each machine is helmed by a skilled artisan, well-versed in extracting the utmost from these mechanical marvels. In the heartland of the United States, the sprawling wheat fields create a mesmerizing spectacle. A sea of golden wheat undulates gracefully as far as the eye can fathom. Yet, amidst this breathtaking expanse lies a bustling scene of industriousness. 10 colossal machines, marvels of modern ingenuity. The grain, a precious yield, finds its haven in expansive bins, while the chaff elegantly disperses from the rear of the machines. This operation, a spectacle that marries complexity and finesse, demands a wealth of expertise and mastery. Yet, with these technological giants at their helm, American farmers orchestrate the wheat harvest with unparalleled speed and efficacy, fortifying the global supply chain of this indispensable crop. Amidst this captivating display of technological prowess, American farmers underscore their commitment to sustaining the world's nourishment. Through the utilization of these colossal machines, they ensure a steady flow of wheat, symbolizing a pivotal contribution to meeting global sustenance needs. In this breathtaking panorama, where innovation meets the land's bounty, these 10 colossal machines epitomize not just mechanical triumphs, but the unwavering resolve of farmers. They symbolize a harmonious amalgamation of human expertise, agricultural innovation, and an unyielding pursuit of efficiency, all working in tandem to feed a hungry world. Within the expansive tapestry of America's wheat fields, where golden waves sway endlessly, these 10 colossal machines stand as beacons of agricultural mastery. They signify not just technological marvels, but a resolute promise to continually provide sustenance for an ever-growing global populace. The sheer awe and admiration evoked by these heavy-duty machines harvesting wheat are simply undeniable. They stand not only as symbols of engineering prowess, but also as embodiments of pride and relentless dedication within the American farming community. Every machine, every powerhouse engine, every intricate technical component astonishes with the finesse of its design, leaving one marveling at the ingenuity of the designers and engineers behind them. The individuals operating these machines deserve utmost respect and admiration for their expertise and mastery of technology. Their remarkable finesse and unmatched efficiency are not just emblematic of agricultural precision, but also a clear testament to the innovation and advancement within the industry. They go beyond the simple act of wheat harvesting, carrying with them a deeper significance, a testament to human progress and our ability to overcome immense challenges. The pride of American farmers extends beyond merely utilizing cutting-edge technology. It lies in their pioneering spirit, contributing significantly to the global provision of sustenance. Witnessing these machines in action leaves one in awe of the power of human creativity and unwavering perseverance in forging new frontiers in agriculture. And it's these heavy-duty machines, standing resolutely amidst the vast wheat fields, that vividly represent the pride, strength, and magnificence of American agriculture. It's not just pride in technology, but also pride in the unceasing dedication of individuals working tirelessly to feed the world. Through an inspiring journey of discovery, with groundbreaking agricultural machinery, we've witnessed the boundless potential and sheer might of these marvels in propelling the advancement of modern agriculture. They aren't just tools, they stand as indispensable companions, fostering convenience, efficiency, and sustainability in global agricultural landscapes. Let's unite to propagate the mission of modern agriculture by embracing and harnessing these cutting-edge technologies. Let's persist in exploring and implementing these advanced technologies, ensuring each stride in agriculture contributes to its prosperity and growth, the cornerstone of our collective progress. Let's share and connect to forge a stronger, more innovative, and sustainable agricultural community. Join us in liking and subscribing to the Future Farming Tech channel to stay updated with the latest insights and knowledge, steering us towards a more prosperous and sustainable agricultural future. Thank you for accompanying us on this meaningful journey.